Hello once again. In today's video I'm going to be showing you how I made a Larp sword scabbard for myself out of household materials. Stay tuned. Greetings, adventurers. Now, we know that sword frogs exist for Larp swords, but sometimes you really just want that full scabbard look, and maybe you don't feel like dropping the exact same amount of money that you just spent on your sword on a scabbard as well. Maybe you're like me and you can't really justify making that big expenditure. But what you can do is make one of these. Now, I made this probably about 2 years ago. I have since thought of much easier methods that this can be done, and I've also thought of various other materials that you could use that might even be better. So follow with me along as I make a brand new scabbard for a Calamasil katana that I have. But bear in mind that while you can follow these exact steps and probably get something that looks even nicer than what I managed to come up with in the couple of hours that I was filming this, really experiment and use your creativity. These can look as utilitarian or as nice and artistic as you want them to look. It really is a craft though, and it is going to require that you purchase some materials that you actually may not already have. But I do encourage you to try to use what you already have, because that's what I did here. So making a scabbard like this is actually pretty simple, and you can do it without even having to make templates. Now, you could make templates and probably come up with a really nice result, and I'm sure that there will be people that are much more artistically talented than me that would be able to take this very simple concept and run with it and create some absolutely epic stuff. And if you do that, send me pictures of it, and maybe I'll feature it in a video or something if that comes up. So what you're going to need is some sort of liner to use for the scabbard. I am using just some cheap fleece that I bought. You are then going to need the body, which is going to provide the rigidity to your scabbard. You could use very thin cardboard like I did. You could use corrugated cardboard if you felt like that was something that you wanted to work with. Corrugated cardboard is much stiffer, so it's a lot more difficult to form, but maybe you'll come up with a different template than I did. I'm thinking that you could probably also use corrugated plastic that you might use for a lawn sign or something like that. That might work. But the most effective thing I'm thinking would be if you were to use very thin sheets of craft foam. Those would be a lot easier to work with. And then you were going to need on the outside some sort of cover. You're going to need some sort of cover that's going to make it look nice and period. I have this black pleather that I also bought along with the fleece. You could go to your local fabric store, probably pick something up. I'm sure they've got stuff on Amazon. And if you're working with foam, you could probably just paint it and then make it look like it was leather without having to do this step. So this is 3 layers: liner, body, cover, and then the tools that we use to put those things together. So you're going to need needle and thread probably. You're going to need some sorts of glue. I have Spray Super 77 that I used back in my own boffer making days. I have just some regular white PVA Elmer's glue, and I also have my DAP contact cement that I use when I'm doing leatherworking. You're not necessarily going to need all of those things, but you might have 1 or 2 of those. Just consider that. You're also going to need a pair of scissors, a knife, and whatever you want to use to aesthetically boost the look of your scabbard. So you could also use these brass tacks that you would use to keep stacks of paper together. Those can look a little bit like rivets. That's a little bit more complicated because it does mean that you then have to punch individual holes through everything and then stick those through. It can be kind of a pain, kind of take a long time. But really use your imagination and use whatever you want to create textures, to create differences in colors, because that's really going to help bring this thing to life. Also, if you check in the description box below, I will list all of the materials that I used and all of the steps that I went through. It might be a little bit more concise than I was able to do it in the video, but some people are visual learners, some people just want to look in the instructions, so go ahead and check down below for that. So let's get right into the steps now. So while making the scabbard for this katana, I actually didn't have to make any templates at all. It was very easy to just sort of form everything around the blade itself, and I didn't have to do any drawings or anything like that. But if you were going to do that, I would suggest setting it up and doing the template on the cardboard first, because the cardboard is going to be the thickest thing, and it's then going to allow you to make the templates for the liner and the cover. It'll just be a lot easier. So if you were going to be making a template for your weapon, especially if you're going to be working with thin cardboard like this that doesn't really like to fold neatly, go ahead and make the template on a piece of paper first, and then you can transfer that shape over. And I would advise just doing just the very tip of the weapon, because that's the one that's going to have the most geometry. And then try to keep all the other lines as straight as you can. And that would even go if you were doing an oddly shaped weapon. If you were doing a weapon that had a pretty severe curve, I've never actually done that. You would need to make a template for that. But go ahead, take that piece of paper and fold it so you know exactly where your center line is, and then line the spine of your weapon up so the blade is facing up towards you, or one of the blades if it's a double-edged weapon, so that you can draw out the exact width of that weapon. Now go ahead and lie the weapon on its side so you can see the entire thing, and then you're going to now take that measurement, but instead of using the center line, you are now going to move the entire weapon over and then use the line that indicated the width and add that onto it. Go ahead and draw this new shape out, then fold it over and then cut the entire thing out. Really hope that makes sense. Now keep in mind that the cover is actually going to have to be slightly bigger than the body is so that everything lines up properly and you don't end up not having enough material to cover the cardboard, because that looks bad. So I have a very meager amount of fleece left, but what I'm doing is I am simply folding it over so that I know how much material I need to fully encase the sword itself. Now I suppose you could do this without doing a liner, but especially if you're using latex weapons, that liner is nice because you can soak it in silicone spray, so that way you never actually have to maintain your weapon. Just every time you put it in and take it out, it gets a nice new coating and you're good and protected. That, and it provides much more retention than just cardboard would. If this were simply cardboard, the sword would slide right out, but because the entire thing is lined with fleece, the sword does not fall out. And it also just protects the sword from being scratched and ruining the paint job or whatever. So we lay the sword onto the fleece and then we fold it over. And then instead of drawing a template, what you can essentially do is just take your needle and thread and sew directly around the blade. Now be sure not to accidentally sew the scabbard to the sword, both because that would sort of suck to have to undo, and also because now you have a needle-sized hole in your blade, and that's not good. So you sew a sock. Once you're done sewing, now you have the line that you can cut along and you have the perfect shape for your blade. No templates needed. Very easy, very easy. Now with my particular design, what I've chosen to do is actually keep the fleece, keep the liner layer about 2.5, 3 inches maybe longer than the actual blade itself, so that it can fold down over the top of the scabbard. It's gonna help hide some of the ugliness of the cardboard and of the cover layer as well. It's a really easy way of just hiding some of those things, and it looks nice as well. So once you've sewn the liner around the blade, the next thing you're going to want to do is actually sew the cover to the liner. Now that's gonna require a bit of 3D thinking, so that you make sure that you sew the cover to the liner in the way that it's going to fold back over itself. Now let me see if I can make this make sense. Because the entire tube of the liner is facing out currently, but when we fold it over, what's on the outside is actually going to be on the inside. What we need to do is reverse the cover so that when we sew it together, it looks nice. Now the easiest way that I actually found to do this is not to try to mess around with angles or any of that. Literally, I just put the sword back into the liner and then put the cover in, eliminating the cardboard layer, and then sewed everything together that way. Now, if you have sort of bigger hands than I do, it might be a little difficult to get into that fold. Another thing you could do is, instead of sewing the sword into the liner first, you can keep the liner flat and then sew that directly to the cover, and then sew the sword into the liner. Again, a little bit more complicated. This is why I actually think that working with leather is easier than doing this, because with leather, all I would have to do is sew the liner, then cut out the leather, glue them together, and I'm essentially done. Whereas this requires actually more steps, and cardboard is harder to work with than leather because you can't wet mold it. So now that you have the inside of the liner sewn to the outside of the cover, we can go ahead and start working on the actual body of the scabbard, the thing that's going to provide it its strength. So first, as you will notice, the actual fold out of the cardboard box I was using is obviously not big enough to actually cover the length of the entire sword. Very simple fix. We want to cut off the tabs, and then we want to cut the box in half and then tape them back together again. And what we really want to avoid is folding the box along its creases that already exist, because that's going to make the scabbard a lot wider than it needs to be, and it's also not going to look as good. You will notice that on this scabbard here, that we actually have a nice rounded edge, as opposed to the flat where the two pieces meet together, and then we need to attach those. This one, a more rounded edge is not only going to look nicer, but it's actually going to provide more structural stability than just a simple fold. So what we're going to do is essentially try to create a new fold out of the flat cardboard. This is going to take a little bit of finagling, and this is why templates for the cardboard are a little difficult, because if you cut the template first, there's no guarantee that the cardboard is going to want to fold in a way that makes those edges line up. So you need to either allow a little bit of excess so that you can clean up the edges afterwards, or you need to do what I did, which is just to take a piece that hasn't been templated, put the sword in it, fold it where the cardboard naturally wants to fold, and then cut the shape out afterwards, if that makes sense. Go ahead and glue the liner now into the inside of the body. Now, I do that with the sword inside because that means that it's a lot easier to place the liner into the body. Just be careful with this because, again, you don't really want to get glue if it's a very liquidy glue. You don't want to get the glue to seep through the fleece and then get on the sword, because that's just a mess no one wants to deal with. It is at this point, before we glue the cover to the outside of the cardboard, that we're going to need to decide whether or not we want to add the belt straps or whether or not we want to add the channels onto the cardboard itself. Now, I sewed the belt loops on this scabbard directly to the cover and then glued the cover on. So this is on there. It's never coming off unless I cut it off. And now the problem with that means I can't take the belt loops off if I want to. The other thing you could do is simply attach belt loops on later, but if you don't have the channels on, then they are likely to slide around. We don't want that either. So allow me to recommend using rope. Just glue a little bit of rope, create channels, figure out the angle that you want the scabbard to sit at, hold that, mark that with a marker, and then you can glue the ropes on. Now, I don't need to do that with the katana scabbard because I was just gonna tuck it into my belt if I even used the scabbard at all. But I'm doing it here so that you can see what that looks like. Also, before you go ahead and cover the body with the actual cover itself, you may find that you want to do some artificial stiffening of the body before you cover it. For instance, on this one that I made, I actually have these long strips of slightly thicker cardboard to help provide a little bit more stability, because otherwise it might bend in easily or flop around too much. If you don't have thicker pieces of cardboard, allow me to recommend using some yardsticks. You could use driveway markers. You could use just extra duct tape layered on. And I saw some article that was saying you could use multiple coats of PVA glue to help harden cardboard. I tried that, and at least for this type of cardboard, it didn't really work. Now that we have that stuff done, now we can put the rest of the scabbard together. So that means spraying the outside of the scabbard, using whatever glue you have on the outside of the scabbard, and then delicately applying the cover onto the body of the scabbard. Now, I never really got good at this. I have creases, I have wrinkles here and there. That might just be how it is, or maybe I'm just bad, and I'm sure someone could come up with a much nicer looking version of this than me. Again, I'm just showing you how to do it. I'm not showing you that I'm doing it right. And then at this point, you are essentially done. Now, when I made this one, I went through the painstaking process of literally punching holes through the cardboard and the cover and then hand stitching it together. And I have no idea why I did it that way, other than that I knew that's how leather workers did it, and I wanted to get it close to that. Now, it does hold together very well, but it was an unnecessary amount of work for, you know, what it is that this is. If you were using craft foam instead of using cardboard, you could simply harden that up by spraying a couple layers of Flex Seal or something like on it to help harden it up a little bit, rubberize it a little bit. Then you could either glue over it or then just paint on it directly. In fact, that might be a really good second video to do if I get my hands on a sheet of craft foam large enough. Let me know in the comments if you'd want to see that as well. So now that the cover is glued to the body, you are essentially done. There's just a couple more things you could do. Again, you could add the faux rivets in the form of the little anchors. So another final thing that I did on the scabbard was actually to add a cap on the end of it so that it adds a little bit more stability on the end there so that I can actually stand it up on itself without having to worry about the scabbard itself bending. I used a slightly thicker form of pleather for like outdoor furniture upholstery. It's waterproof, stuff like that. That is a very important thing. If you do what I did, know that this scabbard is not waterproof, and if you take it out into the rain, it will probably just melt. And so here we have the finished katana scabbard. Now, is it the nicest work that I've done? No, absolutely not. Was I doing it just for demonstration purposes for this video, because I don't actually need to make a cardboard scabbard? Yes, that is the case. But here we go. Slides out nicely, as you can see, because of the inner lining. Very good retention. And there we have it. Nice and easy. And so I was originally actually planning on lining this entire thing with those paper anchors, but I ended up running out of time, and it was more important that I put the video out, that I made this as nice as it could be, considering how I'm not actually really going to be using it. Again, this was for demonstration purposes mostly. But if I do decide to put those rivets on, you can go ahead and follow me on Instagram. I'll post a picture of it there. Living Anachronism Official on Instagram. There will be a link down below. And especially if you were just going to buy a cheap sort of scabbard on Amazon or something like that. Generally those cheaper products that advertise that they are leather armor or leather scabbards or something, this is actually what that is. And their production quality might be nicer than I was able to accomplish, maybe because they had machines or they're just better than me, but it's not actually leather. It is fake leather over a body, maybe with a lining if you're lucky. And if you can make that yourself for cheaper, why wouldn't you? And I will get up close to show you what those ropes looked like. But there you have it, a very simple way that you can get your first LARP sword scabbard for very cheap and do it yourself. And maybe this is your first LARP sword and you don't know if you're going to be sticking with it. You don't want to spend a whole bunch of money on a custom scabbard for it because you don't know if you're just going to chuck it the next time you go to a LARP, but you want to have the look anyway. This is definitely something to consider. And maybe your first LARP sword is something that you picked after watching my How to Choose Your First LARP Sword video, in which case I have a very heavy hand on how your character was designed, and that's pretty awesome. But my fellow adventurers, thank you for watching the video today. Really hope you came up with some new ideas, maybe a new design for a scabbard if you're planning on building your own. I will see you all next time. Very good luck on your adventures. I have to be careful about not hitting my own lights.